Welcome to another one of our podcasts on the Catholic intellectual tradition. I'm Professor Steven Dougherty, and today our guest is Dr. Sean Brennan, who's going to talk to us about Catholicism in film. Welcome, Dr. Brennan.
Thank you for having me.
So first off, can you tell us what your education is?
Sure, of course. I got my bachelor's degree from Rockhurst University, which is the Jesuit school in Kansas City, in 2001. Majored in history, minored in German and theater. Then I got my master's degree from Villanova, 2003, also modern European history. 2 summers at the Russian language school at Indiana University. And then I got my doctorate from the University of Notre Dame. I graduated there in 2009. Emphasis on modern German and Russian and Austrian history, and American foreign relations as well. And I've been at the University of Scranton since then, since 2009.
So all of your education was in the Midwest. Is that right?
Well, Villanova.
Well, except for Villanova.
Philadelphia.
What drew you here to Scranton?
Well, I got the I got the job, but I'd actually, my 2 years in Philadelphia at Villanova, I'd never come up to the Scranton area. So actually, the first time I came out to northeastern Pennsylvania was for the job interview. But you know, my father was in the Army. I was born in Kentucky. I've lived all over the place, and so I was kind of used to traveling for my education and for my career.
So you replaced Bob Houston, is that right, here at the university?
No, I replaced Frank Homer.
Oh, okay.
He was the 20th century European history specialist. He's primarily a German. He was primarily a German historian. If you had to ask me one country, Russia, and then Germany and Austria right behind it. But basically, yeah, I like to joke, you know, I'm the specialist of European history north of the Alps and east of the Rhine.
All right, so so today we're going to talk about film and Catholicism in film. So as primarily a historian of the last 100 years, do you think that film is the premier art form of the past 100 years?
Yes, I do. It's certainly the most widely distributed. And someone who, trust me, I do not admire the man, but he occasionally would say things that were correct. You know, Vladimir Lenin once said that filmmaking was the greatest tool to mold the minds of men that had ever been invented. And obviously he was specifically talking about the Soviet film industry and the impact it would have, but I think he was right about that.
So you think nothing else has really impacted the way people think and view things as much as film in the past 100 years?
No, I would say that even with the rise of social media in the late 20th century, and especially in the 21st century, that's kind of started to rival it. And certainly film, because of digital streaming and whether people see movies in the cinema or at home or off their computer or off their iPhone, it's going through extraordinarily rapid changes. But so perhaps not quite as influential as it once was, because so many different forms of entertainment now and receiving them. But yes, profoundly influential in the 20th century.
Well, I see the main change I see now for real actual film that are interesting to watch, not 15-second TikTok videos.
Yeah.
Are things like Netflix and Prime Video, where you can essentially make a film that's 10 hours long, right? The handcuffs are off to the creative process in that sense. So they could either really produce a 10-hour really pile of terrible film or something really, really good, I think.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, with streaming services, it's allowing certain directors to make films that literally they would not have been able to make in the studio period, when basically everyone had to watch a film in theaters. And it would be years before it showed up on TV. Or even 15, 20 years ago. I mean, one example I kind of come back to, and maybe we'll talk about this movie later because there are some Catholic themes in it, was Martin Scorsese's movie from 2019, The Irishman. You know, he was able to use the actors he wanted and digitally de-age them. You know, Robert De Niro, Al Pacino, and Joe Pesci. And he was able to make it 3.5 hours long. And in order to tell the story that he wanted to tell. And kind of it's Scorsese's kind of last gangster film. And you get the idea. He wanted to say everything he really wanted to say in this one. You wouldn't have had a film like that made. It would have been a mini-series, and then it would have been different even 10 years ago, and certainly not 20 years ago.
Well, the miniseries was a big change. I remember Roots being the first one that really impacted the country. But I think that's an excellent example in that Roots definitely changed the way Americans viewed slavery. Because many of them didn't know the horrors of slavery. They knew of its existence, of course. But with a film, it hit home that people saw these characters who they grew to love, and saw them being tortured and all these terrible things. And I think it opened up a lot of people's eyes to the history of the United States.
Oh, I agree. And another film that I think is one of the most important films of the last 50 years, from a historical perspective, is Saving Private Ryan. I mean, not only is it a great film when it came out in 1998, but it changed the way people looked at warfare. Not just especially the Second World War, but even far beyond that as well. Yeah.
All right, so let's start to talk about Catholicism in films. Do you have any film that you'd like to discuss first?
Well, I mean, I think a good one, you mentioned it, is On the Waterfront. That's a great, I think, starting point. Because there's, of course, a heroic Catholic priest there, played by Karl Malden, and I have a personal connection to this film because my second book on the priest Fabian Flynn, the head of War Relief Services and Catholic Relief Services, Edward Swanstrom, he had worked as a priest in some of the dock workers' neighborhoods in New York City, and Karl Malden's character was largely based on him.
Oh.
Yeah. But it's more than just, I always think that for Catholic films, it's got to be a little bit more than just having a priest or a nun or the characters going to church or referencing God. I think it's a film that discusses particularly Catholic themes, and I think On the Waterfront definitely does. Even though its director, Elia Kazan, was Greek Orthodox, and I don't know how religiously observant he was, but that film gets into the themes of committing an awful act. Marlon Brando's character inadvertently helped get Eva Marie Saint's brother's character killed, and how you have to do a difficult thing and pay a very high price for it in order to make up for what you've done. And sometimes that's a very lonely process. Now Kazan was also making the film a little bit as an analogy. I mean, it was based on real-life incidences, but his decision to testify to the House of Un-American Activities Committee because of the fact that he had been a member of the Communist Party and broke with the party over the Hitler-Stalin Pact in 1939, and some people have argued that the character Lee J. Cobb's character Johnny Friendly is a little bit analogous to Stalin, brutal, murderous tyrant who presents himself as a friend of the working man and as a man who's fighting for social justice when he's anything but. But it can work. The film can work both ways. You can see the more political themes in there and what Kazan was perhaps trying to say, but also the Catholic themes as well.
The director even takes a cameo role at the end of the film when he tells everyone, let's get back to work at the very end of the scene, right? But I think the film is primarily about redemption. Yeah. But I think the most Catholic thing about that film is Karl Malden's character's speech when he's down in the hull of the ship, when he's talking about a crucifixion and the Johnny Friendly's thugs are throwing fruit down at him and hitting them. It's really something tremendously heroic, that he was going to stand up for what was right, even though, as you said, there were going to be tremendous consequences against it.
And also that passage of that Jesus asks his followers that you might have to deny your brother, your family. And I'm reminded of the scene where Marlon Brando talks about how he doesn't want to testify against Johnny Friendly, and by consequence his brother, who's one of his lieutenants, goes, hey, he's my brother, and I remember Johnny Friendly as a kid took me to ball games, and Karl Malden just dismisses that right off the bat. Like, you got the woman you love's brother killed, right? And who cares about him taking you to ball games? You have to do what's right. So it's very much that kind of muscular, forceful Catholicism on display there.
I think the interesting thing about the character of the priest in that movie is that priests in movies are often either displayed very one-dimensional. Either there's something super nice like Father O'Malley and Going My Way or The Bells of St. Mary's. They're just a general nice guy, not a deep character. I think Karl Malden's character was a very deep character. He was showing a full-fledged character, somebody with a real internal dialogue. And he really showed Catholic themes through that person, I think.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. The priest is portrayed either as generically very nice, or he's kind of an ineffectual wimp, and that's only if he's not hiding some type of horrible secret.
Yeah, yeah. So I think that was one of the best roles for a priest inside of a movie. There was also a movie with ties to this area, which was Miracle of the Bells, which I don't even know if you've ever seen.
I haven't seen that one.
It's such an obscure movie, but Frank Sinatra played the priest. And Frank Sinatra asked, he first said he couldn't play it because his own life was so maybe immoral in his eyes, that he thought the church would be upset with him. And so he asked that the producers, ask a cardinal if Frank Sinatra could play the role, and the cardinal said, "Yeah, sure." Right? But it's not a very good movie, but it does take place just beneath Wilkes-Barre in a sort of fictional coal town. It doesn't exactly portray the area in a very positive light, but it is an example of someone playing a priest. In the same way, Bing Crosby didn't really want to play a priest because he thought his own life was lacking the moral fiber to play a priest too, but the church did not object. I mean, I think they thought, well, you're an actor, you're not going to be a priest, you're going to be somebody portraying a priest.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, another film, if you jumped, another Best Picture winner, jump from 1954 to 1966, A Man for All Seasons. That's another great example where, in this case, the screenwriter, who was also the playwright, Robert Bolt, was conveying one type of message, but the religious themes still come across. I mean, Bolt says in his introduction to the play that he is not a Catholic and it was a lapsed Christian at best. But one thing Bolt was very active in the 50s and 60s and had gone to jail for was protesting against the Western countries, particularly the United Kingdom, acquiring nuclear weapons. And so that's why he was attracted to the story of Sir Thomas More, because of someone else who was willing to suffer for his convictions. Okay.
So as a historian, how accurate do you think the history is in that movie?
It leaves certain things out to, I think, make More a little bit more sympathetic. I mean, More had been a proponent of, a reluctant proponent of, but a proponent of expelling Protestants from England after the Reformation began in continental Europe, and in some cases, if they kept refusing to recant, of having them burned at the stake. So obviously that in his time, that was seen as a fairly exceptional attitude. You didn't want to endanger the religious unity of the country. Obviously, 5 centuries later, it looks a little bit more problematic. I mean, I love Leo McKern's portrayal of Thomas Cromwell, but and this is the play too. I mean, everything you see in the film is in the play. The film's a very close adaptation of the play, but Cromwell is just portrayed as this Machiavellian, cold-blooded enforcer of the king's will, when as in real life we know that Thomas Cromwell, one of his descendants, by the way, was Oliver Cromwell.
Much more problematic figure.
Right, very problematic figure. Thomas Cromwell did have Lutheran sympathies. He was part of the, perhaps a little bit smaller in number initially until Henry VIII makes the break from Rome, but he did sympathize with that. So it was more than just, if the king wants a divorce, we're going to do his will and crush anyone who gets in his way. He was somewhat enthusiastic about, for theological reasons, the creation of a new form of religious institution in England that was no longer the Catholic Church.
So with respect to this podcast, I think the other thing that that film is practically an endorsement of is the Catholic intellectual tradition.
Yeah. And
that they show Thomas as just filled with the Catholic intellectual tradition, that even his daughters he educated. There's that famous scene where the daughter speaks better Latin than Henry VIII.
Henry VIII, yeah.
And is probably much, much better educated than the King of England.
And that did make More kind of an exceptional person in his era, that he had all 5 of his children. I think he and his wife had 3 children and adopted 2 others. He had his daughters just as well educated as his sons. And obviously, the 5 becomes the 1 in the play and the film in Margaret. I mean, that's something that it's a common thing to do when adapting for historical events.
So even in the Office of the Readings for his day, it's a letter from him to his daughter from prison. So this was obviously an extremely important relationship for him. And that was strange for the time, to think that the education of his daughter was the utmost thing in his life, which wouldn't have been common for other people of his status in that time.
Yeah, exactly. And if you look at Utopia, for example, I mean, many aspects of Utopia, particularly their religious beliefs, don't correspond with More's. And and that's whenever I do my European History Survey Part 1, one of the books I had them read is Utopia. And it's one of those ones, Machiavelli's The Prince is another, where you talk about, do you think More's writing an actual guide here, or is this kind of a satire with some elements of truth in it? And again, getting back to the film, I mean, one other little thing is, and it's funny how you have to portray people as something. Like Henry VIII at the time didn't have his famous beard, but of course Robert Shaw does.
Yeah.
Because I think Fred Zinnemann said that people think, if that's Henry VIII, where's the beard? Right? So, but at least they did portray Henry VIII as a physically fit man, which he was at the time. In some of the portraits and portrayals of him later is this very corpulent figure. That wasn't the way Henry was at the time.
Sure, in his youth he was extremely athletic, but then hurt himself.
A jousting tournament.
And that's what caused his becoming overweight, because he still ate as if he was being incredibly physically active and was no longer physically active at all.
Yeah, towards the end of his life, he couldn't mount his horse, and they had to get him around on a very primitive early 16th century version of a wheelchair. Yeah.
So in both of those cases, for both of those films, I think the other thing that makes the Catholicism so sympathetic is that they were excellent films. As you said, both films won Best Picture.
Yeah.
So I think when you're watching an excellent portrayal of something, you tend to be sympathetic towards the ideas that they're presenting.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, I mean, we can get into this a little bit later. One thing I'm a little bit encouraged with is a number of films coming out with explicitly Christian themes over the last few years. They're starting to be of better quality and getting better actors and writers and directors. Because there's always been kind of a subgenre of Christian or Catholic themed movies, but often the quality isn't very good, the acting isn't very good, and it's only meant for one specific genre of moviegoers. And I think we're moving a little bit away from that now. Movies like, we can get into later, but Father Stew is a great recent example of that. I saw that a few months ago. And even though this is about an evangelical Protestant, not a Catholic, but the movie about Kurt Warner, American Underdog, was, I thought, another fairly solid film with, again, fairly solid actors in it that reached a wider crowd.
I think we've had a history of this, not just in film, but in literature, these sort of hagiographies of saints where they're... I read them and I can't stand them there because they're not a good book. It's a terribly written sort of just trying to say, oh, this person never had any real struggles. They took everything as being perfect and they were always this perfect person. Where if you say you read something like A Story of a Soul, St. Teresa's thing, she's honest about her own drawbacks, right? So I wouldn't say that was a well-written book. She wasn't an author in the traditional sense, but it really shows some really great ideas. Like she would say, oh, this nun came, when one of the sisters came, I really couldn't stand her, but I was trying to be as nice as possible to her, and she would take a Christian view of this. So it didn't portray them as being silly. I think a lot of films sort of portray the religious aspects as something childish, right? Aimed more at an 8-year-old than a rational thinking person. Not that an 8-year-old is not rationally thinking, but on certainly a different level. How about another film that you think is important in this genre?
Well, I would say we could jump around a little bit in the time chronology. I would say that another one that came out about 10 years ago that I thought was a pretty impressive film, also based on a play, was called Doubt. It was this film that came out with Philip Seymour Hoffman, Meryl Streep, and Amy Adams, and it's set in the early 1960s. As the church is kind of grappling with the changes of the Second Vatican Council, and Meryl Streep plays a nun who is not happy with that, and Amy Adams plays one who is, and Philip Seymour Hoffman's rather open to that as well, and it gets into the churches providing for educational opportunities for children in the cities, including increasingly by this period minority children, African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and also it deals with the issue of without ever confirming it, whether it happened or not, of the tremendous problem in the church, the issue of molestation of children.
The film really has you guessing at the end.
It does.
I mean, I guess that's why the title is Doubt, but I mean, you really walk away not 100% sure that he's guilty or innocent. I mean, you really, and I think the doubt is there in everybody's mind, all the characters and the viewer.
Yeah. And also something I get into, and this has been my... And my fiancée, Stephanie Longo, has heard me go off about this, but my colleague Bob Shaffron, he did a great podcast with. Meryl Streep's character is a terrible human being. She's a terrible human being. And this is a problem, I think, at the Catholic Church for too long, that often when they were getting people to be priests and nuns, at least in the United States, but it's a problem in other countries too, they're not recruiting their best. And you've had too many people in the clergy who think that because they've taken their vows and they've dedicated their life to God, they can act like terrible people. And it's turned people away from the churches. And particularly for people who had to go to Catholic schools and Catholic orphanages, physical corporal punishment being the first step rather than the last resort. It's a huge problem in Ireland, for example. I mean, the revelations of how nuns ran schools and orphanages and houses for troubled women, which was a very ambiguous term that can mean anything. They ran them like prisons, like labor camps. They ran, and completely against the teachings and model of Jesus. I mean, I've always understood and run into a few people like that, a few Catholic clergy like that if you dedicated your life to following Jesus, Jesus was a kind and nice man, among other things. Yes, there was that thing with the money lenders in the temple, but generally he was. Shouldn't you act like him? And she's so clearly not. And I've always thought that Amy Adams' character, if she has to work with her for too much longer, she's either going to transfer or she's going to leave herself. So I think that's another important theme in the film.
So historically, why do you think that happened? Was it, certainly that was common in other parts of the culture as well, not just to the Catholic Church. If you looked at American schools in the 1950s, let's say, corporal punishment was just standard in many schools. Not just Catholic schools, but not just private schools, and public schools as well. Even by the time I was in school in the 70s, we still had corporal punishment.
And in the 80s.
And in the 80s.
When I was in elementary school.
It certainly wasn't as common, but it was, the vice principal still had a paddle, and you could get paddled. Some students, my brother amongst them, used to ask for the paddle because he didn't want to go to detention.
Right.
So it was... but it was far from uncommon. So, but in the Catholic schools, I think, in many of the Catholic schools, depending upon which schools, not all the schools, but I think a lot of times it depended on their ethnicity. I think the German schools were particularly harsh, and the Irish schools were particularly harsh. That they were, because they were bringing their own culture to bear there, where they thought corporal punishment was a necessary thing.
Yeah.
So do you think, what has changed about that?
Well, I think it's just become much more socially unacceptable. And not just in schools and the home life as well. I mean, I had great parents and everything, but if you got out of line, you could. It was for sometimes I did. You could get corporal punishment there too. Now that's seen as, almost, to use a German term, verboten, forbidden, and even more so on the other side of the Atlantic. And again, I'm not saying in certain cases at educational institutions you might not need something like that. But again, I think the problem was way too often it was not the last resort, but the first one.
Almost like an Augustinian just war theory, that it has to be the last option imaginable before you would go into this, right?
Right.
The use of force in any sense, and that's in the Catholic tradition. It was always the use of force had to be the last possible thing, right? Even in early Christian writings, force sometimes was not even acceptable in your own self-defense. It was only for the defense of others, some people would argue. So, it really was an absolute last resort. But for some large part of the 20th century, that was gone. And that film certainly shows you that. There were other films that showed you that as well. That they certainly went to corporal punishment far too early.
And there's a great, I didn't mention this in the list of you, but I'm just thinking of this now. He's an English director. He's Catholic. His name is Ken Russell. Did a lot of crazy psychedelic films. And he did one that came out in 1971 called The Devils, which is about a real-life incident during the reign of Louis XIII in the village of Loudun, the free city of Loudun in France, where this priest was accused of practicing witchcraft and bringing about the demonic possession of a whole convent full of nuns. And as crazy as that film is, and it's not an easy film to take, it got rated X in 1971. It still hasn't gotten a proper release. It's still so controversial. But one of the key points of that film is, at the time, was a lot of women who became nuns only entered in the convent because their families couldn't marry them off. And if you're going to enter into that kind of lifestyle, in my opinion, thrive in it, whether you're a man or a woman, it has to be a decision you make for yourself. If your family just sends you there because they can't know what else to do with you, it will end disastrously. And there's a theme about Vanessa Redgrave plays this nun who's physically handicapped, who becomes obsessed with the priest played by Oliver Reed, sexually obsessed with him. And you get the idea that she never wanted to be a nun in the first place, neither did a lot of the women there. And so that kind of accounts for a lot of their bizarre repressed behavior. And even today, I mean, you have some people who've entered into the clergy, the church, because they didn't know what else to do with their life, or because they thought, well, at least this is a way I can be taken care of. And I think one of the points of that recent film, Father Stu, is if you're going to succeed in this kind of thing, you have to be totally dedicated for it, because you hear the calling, so to speak. And if you're just put in there for other circumstances, you're usually not going to do as well.
So let's talk about some films that you really like, the Scorsese films. In particular, I heard Scorsese say many times that in his neighborhood growing up, there were basically two forces. There were these criminals, you know, often minor petty criminals, but criminals nonetheless. And there was the church. And philosophically, they were completely opposed to each other, but they existed side by side. Now, I think this goes to a much larger thing that we talked about this with Dr. Shafran, and that when Christianity became part of the Roman Empire, the Roman values sort of went along with the Christian values. And they're really different values, right? I mean, and same with, say, the mafia values and the church values. I mean, the mafia valued strength and power, and even in the Godfather,
and secrecy.
Yeah, and secrecy. Even in the Godfather, they talk about how they structure the family based on the Roman legions, right? So they're looking at a much different set of values than the church was, but you would still have people intertwined in both parts of this, and families. Right, you could maybe have a daughter become a nun and a son become a mobster, kind of thing. Right, that's the kind of things that were in his film. So to talk about the films that you see discussing this.
Yeah, well, I mean, Scorsese has always been open about his strong religious beliefs, but if you look at his personal life, it's kind of crazy. I mean, the problems of alcohol and cocaine addiction, 4 marriages. So he's someone who believes but struggles to act along his beliefs, and you see a lot of that in a lot of his films. I also love his little aside. He, I think when Goodfellas was coming out, he was talked about his first encounter with someone from the mafia. He talked about having to wait in line in New York City as a kid, 3 hours for a haircut of all these other boys, right? Because the barber's really busy. And he said this flashy guy, flashy Italian American, or probably Sicilian American guy, showed up in a nice suit and just walked past all of them and sat right there in the chair. And the barber immediately, you know, spent a long time making sure he got his hair the right way. So that kind of colored his experiences going forward. And not all of Scorsese's films deal with religious themes. So a lot of them do, though. And some only a little bit. Other times it's throughout the whole film. Like, for example, Raging Bull is a great example of that. Despite the fact that there's only one like background character who's a priest, you see him in a couple of scenes. But I love the theme of that film as it shows how Jake LaMotta, another terrible human being, everything that made him such a great boxer, the fact that he was such a vicious, mean, hot-tempered man, made him so great in the ring, it destroyed everything in his life outside of it. And it's only at the very end of the film where he reconciles with his brother, maybe, and starts a new career that he's starting to be redeemed a little bit. And I think Scorsese is talking about something you see in Christian theology, that if we give in to our baser instincts, if we don't follow the church's teachings, we lose our humanity. We become like animals. Like, there's a great scene at the beginning when Robert De Niro as Jake LaMotta is yelling at someone outside the hall because LaMotta's yelling at his wife. And the guy says, "What are you doing, you crazy animals?" And LaMotta's like, "Who are you calling an animal?" And the guy says, you don't see him, but you're an animal, right? And then towards the end, it's an amazing callback to that. Towards the end of the film, when he's in Florida and he's being thrown in prison because he was allowing underage girls into his nightclub, introducing them to men who got them drunk and raped them almost certainly. He's thrown in a jail cell, and he's crying and pounding the wall and realizing everything bad that's happened in his life has largely been because of his bad decisions. And he's saying, "I'm not an animal. I'm not an animal." And he knows he is, and he knows because of his actions. And
I think in that film they show a lot of LaMotta has a lot of self-hatred, that he's almost self-abusive. He picks decisions that he knows are going to hurt him, and they show that in The Ring too, when he just sort of leans against the ropes and lets Sugar Ray Robinson beat the crap out of him, just to show how tough he was. that he could take anything, but that shows like a sort of self-hatred. That, in other words, all that he was good for was to take a beating.
Yeah.
And I think that was that he rejects his sort of humanity in that sense, right? You're showing that this is somebody who lost his humanity, Jake LaMotta.
Right.
Right. So maybe that doesn't hurt him so much in the ring, but as you said, but it hurts him in life, right? And he loses that relationship with his brother, with his wife, with everybody in the film, right?
It's like that great, and everyone. I mean, there's that great scene when he's going to go on trial for his activities in the nightclub, and he has to take the championship belt from his wife's home, and she's like, "Don't you have some friends you can raise the money with?" He's like, "What friends?" And it has that famous quote from the Bible at the end about the blind man who can now see. And I would say another film, obviously, that gets into themes, religious themes, is, of course, Silence. That's the most outrightly religious film I think Scorsese has ever done, about the experience of Portuguese Jesuit missionaries in Japan, and the tremendous suffering they went through, and so many Japanese Christians went through during that time period. And it goes into another dilemma for Christians who lived under persecution. Can you outwardly renounce your faith but inwardly still practice it? And does that make you a real Christian or a hypocrite? Because, of course, that's what Andrew Garfield's forced to do at the end. But then the very final scene in the film kind of hints that not only was he probably still a practicing Christian, but so was the wife he was forcibly married off to. Right? And, of course, and he's a very controversial priest for good reasons, but he had James Martin as one of the advisors on the film. And Andrew Garfield, for example, I think Liam Neeson, too, went through the Jesuit spiritual exercises in preparation for their roles. And Scorsese, of course, famously dedicates the film in the end to Japan's Christian community. But even the film he made right before that, The Wolf of Wall Street, and it also is kind of like Raging Bull, is it deals with a terrible human being, Jordan Belfort, who's not physically violent, but he's incredibly, unbelievably hedonistic, right, in terms of drugs and sex, and so are most of the people he works with. But in the end, it doesn't end that well for any of them, and you get the idea it didn't give him any real satisfaction and happiness. So, and I think Scorsese is certainly making an interesting spiritual message there, and also how even for people who live that kind of lifestyle, in that scene when he and his wife and his friend are on that yacht in the Mediterranean, which looks like it's about to be sank by an enormous wave. His friend, played by Jonah Hill, says, "I don't want to die. I can't die right now. I've done all these horrible things. I'm going to go to hell." You don't see that, in just even a character saying that in movies very more, but you see it in a Scorsese film.
I think a lot of his films have the theme of, once you start taking one step down that evil path, then, okay, you're really doomed, because it keeps drawing you farther and farther and farther down that path, right? So you think, well, I'll just do this one bad thing and make some money. I'll just do this other thing and I'll just do this. But by the end, you just like Jake LaMotta, you lose your humanity, right? You really fall down the pit into absolute destruction. You lose your family. You lose everything else. Yeah,
and he leaves his first very supportive wife for Margot Robbie's character, and basically when it's clear he's not going to be Mr. Moneybags anymore, she basically says, I don't love you anymore because of that. And you get the idea his first wife would have stuck through him through thick and thin. And of course, we get to The Irishman. Again, it's the idea, if we've led a horrible life, if we've done terrible things, is there even a way to seek contrition for them? Right? Like, I always come back, because I watched the film last week, kind of in preparation for this. De Niro has alienated everyone in his family. He has to pick out his own coffin because no one else is going to do it for him. And his eldest daughter, who's clearly his favorite, never wants to speak to him anymore, because she knows that now there's still some debate whether this guy actually did this, but at least in the film, he murdered Jimmy Hoffa, who his daughter greatly admired. And even that scene where he's talking to the priest and trying to say he's sorry, he can't quite bring himself. He says, "Do you feel any sympathy for the families?" And Nero's character is like, "Well, I didn't really know any of the families." except for Hoffa's family, right? And he's still refusing to tell the FBI about what happened. So the film leaves it on kind of an ambiguous note that even if he's praying with the priest and doing confession, how sorry is he really? And is there a way, after leading a life of evil, that there's any path for redemption for you?
And for us, that film has local flavor, right? A lot of those events occurred in northeastern Pennsylvania.
Yeah, the Buffalino family from Old Forge and
from Pittston,
Pittston,
Old Forge, yeah. So I mean, they were certainly this area was highly involved in a lot of those things. Yeah. In fact, supposedly, when Buffalino got the report that Hoffa had been killed, he was in a restaurant in Old Forge called Brutico's, which doesn't exist anymore, but it's taken over. It has a new name. But that was always the story, that he was in there and they call. There were no cell phones in those days, and he was called away, and they just gave him some obscure message, which he knew what that meant. But certainly, as an Italian American myself, I always thought it was interesting to see how these two different ideals were sort of carried through families. In the Godfather, they talk about this too, and in the book much more than the movie.
Yeah.
But in the book, even though the book was much dirtier than the movie.
Oh, yeah.
Substantially dirtier
Especially
than the movie.
that long segment with Sony's mistress.
Yeah.
I remember reading The Godfather before I saw the movies in 9th grade, and I was like, whoa, reading that. We won't go into it, but it was...
It was highly explicit, let's say. But the last line of the book is something along the lines of Kay Adams saying the prayers for her husband, right? So Kay Adams starts to go to morning mass with her mother-in-law because she realizes, like her mother-in-law, she has to pray for her husband because her husband does awful, awful things, right? So she, in fact, becomes Catholic. Kay Adams was a Protestant,
right? Which
in the book Michael Corleone likes because he wanted to be more American. He thought
Absolutely.
Being Protestant was more American.
He wanted to marry a WASP, exactly.
And become
from New Hampshire.
Yeah, become really
right.
American, right? Super American. But they show that idea that, so here you can have this woman like Don Corleone's wife is going to mass every day. Now she knows what her husband is doing. She knows that it's evil, but she stands by him and prays for his soul every day. Right? So these two contradictory ideas are going through a community, right? And that's part of the reason I think why those films are so good, because the people in these films are not all pure evil or they're not all pure good. There's the raging contest like there is in all of us between good and evil, and they're trying to balance that off. And so a good filmmaker can really show you that, I think.
Yeah, and originally that was how The Godfather 72 was going to end, like it does in the book, with Kay praying for the soul of her husband. But Coppola wanted to end it with the famous shot of the closing door, and I'm glad he did, because it's such an iconic ending. But yeah, I think that Godfather 2, because Michael becomes even worse, and then I wish Godfather 3 was never made, but it shows that, and it only was made because Coppola was having financial problems, which he always had. I mean, Coppola's life would make a great movie. It's crazy. But that Michael's attempts to redeem himself end disastrously. And he dies an old recluse. And I think going back to The Irishman, too, I think they're kind of making a point that it doesn't really matter who else is... It's always an issue I've had with the idea of praying for somebody else's soul. Because you could pray for them. I've always thought a better idea would be to pray for them to recognize their evil and to confess to it. And because I think if you don't do that yourself, it's not going to matter how many other people are praying for your soul. And again, the ambiguous ending of The Irishman, whether De Niro is either truly sorry or it's just he knows he's going to die soon. And so he's finally being forced to think about these issues that he never has really had to before.
Sure, and Godfather 3, which Godfather 1 and 2 are perfect movies, and Godfather 3, of course, is not. But there is that scene where he's going to confession, and he's confessing all of the things he did, right? But you really wonder, is he really confessing them? Is he really sorry he did these things, right? Which is not at all clear. But how do you live? It's showing how difficult it is. How do you live with having killed your brother, let's say, right? I mean, that's something. I mean, that's in some sense, the worst crime you could commit, right? Killing a brother, killing somebody,
killing a
family member. That's about as bad as it gets, right? Especially a family member who was as weak and stupid as Fredo, where it wasn't malice, it was weakness and stupidity. Right. And by that time, Fredo was back at home and no longer a threat. He just had to kill him for show.
Yeah, it's
right?
and also just vengeance because
Yeah.
he couldn't bring himself to forgive his brother.
Yeah. Which is the exact opposite of Christianity, right?
Yeah.
Vengeance
Yeah.
is the opposite of Christianity.
Exactly. And I think that I will say this in fairness to 3. Coppola had to completely rewrite the script because originally it was the plan for the film was Tom Hagen, Robert Duvall's character, versus Michael Corleone, and Robert Duvall dropped out the last minute, I think over salary concerns. So Coppola had to completely rewrite the script, and so because it took him forever to come up with an idea for Godfather 3, and he finally had it, and then he had to scrap it at the last minute. So I mean the film's watchable, and I do like how, without putting in spoilers, how Michael finally gets the comeuppance he's had coming for 2 movies. But the biggest issue is it didn't need to be made. I mean, 1 and 2
They told the story. Yeah.
told the story.
Yeah, but at the end, well, again, I don't want to give a spoiler, but how he dies in the end, it sort of says, had all this not happened, he'd probably be in the same courtyard, dying in the same place.
Yeah.
But it shows him dying alone, which is always sort of the saddest image you could have. You don't have anybody in your life close enough that wants to be there with you when you're going to die. Yeah. You know, I mean, that's sort of a sad remark.
Speaking of another Best Picture winner that I think its Catholic messages have gotten forgotten in many ways. And actually, like A Man for All Seasons, and Sound of Music's the other one, is a rare example of a play that won the Best Play Tony that was made into a movie that won Best Picture, and that's Amadeus. Because that film is awash in a Catholic environment and symbolism and themes. And people get so fixated on the idea of classical music, and everything there. I mean, it was directed by Milos Forman, who grew up in a Catholic environment in Czechoslovakia. It's set in ultra Habsburg Catholic Austria in Vienna in the late 1700s. And I think it deals with... I read this somewhere, that... Thomas Aquinas believed that envy and pride are perhaps the worst of the 7 deadly sins because they lead to the rest, right? And I realize that the story of Amadeus is many ways fictionalized. There's some minor historical evidence they use to build a much bigger story. Like Mozart did write to his father at one point. He thought Salieri and the other Italians at the Viennese court were trying to sabotage him. But that's basically it's one letter, right? I mean, Salieri did a lot to popularize Mozart's music after he died, for example. And there's other historical inaccuracies too. Like Salieri talks to the priest at the beginning of the film about how he took a vow of chastity if God would give him great musical talent. Salieri, I think, had 14 children, so he didn't take he didn't take that. But I love how that film deals with the sin of envy and how people get angry and resentful towards God because he didn't give them what they wanted. Right? That Salieri is a very talented composer. Historically and also depicted in the film. It's just he doesn't quite have the talent of Mozart, who's one of the greatest musical geniuses of all time. And because he's angry that God didn't give him that talent, he doesn't just want to get revenge on Mozart, he wants to get revenge on God by trying to, in the end, claim some of Mozart's music as his own and be proclaimed for it.
Yeah.
And again, I like how the film, towards the end, when Mozart's sick and he's dying and Salieri is helping him write the Requiem, and it's beautifully played by F. Murray Abraham and Thomas Hulse. Mozart says to Salieri, you've always, not knowing that Salieri's been trying to sabotage him. Yeah. Now, the film makes it clear Mozart did a lot to sabotage his own career, even without Salieri, but he says, you've always been so kind to me, and I thought you didn't like my music. And the way F. Murray Abraham plays it, this shame on his face and guilt, and he tells him, honestly, you're the greatest composer I've ever known. And I like how that film illustrates that all of Salieri's attempts to get revenge, it doesn't make him any happier or any more against Mozart or against God, doesn't make him any happier or any more fulfilled.
It makes him far less happy. Far less happy. I always took Salieri to be a composite character of just things that were going around, which the character is fantastic, but obviously non-historical. Yeah. But I love the scene where Salieri is absolving everyone of their mediocrity.
Yeah, including the priest, right?
Because, I mean, most of us, we're all mediocre in some sense, right? And it's in that sense, it's easy to look at somebody like Mozart, whose, say, personal life is far from exemplary, and being mad. Why does he get this talent? Why does he get to, speak with God's voice in this music? Well, I'm stuck here being mediocre, right? It can be frustrating when you've dedicated your whole life, as we have, to a discipline, right? So if you see somebody who's much better at it than you, and is, you think so unworthy, it can be frustrating.
And especially for someone who, like Salieri, who is talented, and
sure, if you were not talented at all, it wouldn't bother you.
Yeah, if he
it's
wasn't,
that you get
right.
close.
He gets close enough, and
because he alone, when he's watching the Don Giovanni, when he alone is really grasping this all. Mm-hmm. He's the only one who's seeing the real genius of Mozart. So the people in the audience aren't liking it because it's so dark and disappointing, right? Or, distressing, right? And he alone could really see what a phenomenal opera this is and what's going on. So because he's that close, he could see, like, if you're that close to the light, you can see the light, but you can't produce it. That's when it gets frustrating. If you're far, far away from it, then, it's not as frustrating. It's sort of the mediocrity that's frustrating, not if you were terrible and you don't really care, right?
Yeah.
If you can't even play "Mary Had a Little Lamb" on the piano, then everything looks great to you on the piano, right? It's not.
He can recognize the genius better than anyone else, and I think one of the great themes of that film, and not just for Catholicism, most forms of Christianity, is God gives us all talents and abilities, and some are rich in gifts and some are more poor in gifts, but we have to be satisfied. We have to ultimately be at peace with what God has given us, and obviously all of our abilities only become great if we work really hard at them. Mm-hmm. But even then, sometimes no matter how hard you work, there might be someone better, and you just have to live with that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's an important Ignatian theme, since we're at a Jesuit school. Is part of the early Jesuit ideal was that you bring your talents to God, and you use them in any way you can, right? So if you're good at sweeping up the floor, sweep up the floor, right? If they need you to stand on your head in the corner, you stand on your head in the corner, right? It's whatever is sort of needed of you. It's not for your own glory. It's for God's glory, right? It's, as we have written in stone on all of our buildings, Ad Maiorem Dei Gloriam, right? This was the idea they were after, to you bring your talents for the common good, for the good of God, and not just for your own glorification. And I think that's what Salieri is missing, right? Salieri wants his own glory more than he wants to glorify God with his music. He wants his own glory, right? He wants to be Mozart, right?
And again, it ruins him in the end.
Mm-hmm.
And from a personal level, I think I'm a fairly decent historian and teacher and writer. There's plenty of people out there better than me. And I think that, and the idea is for me just to go out and produce the best kind of scholarship that I'm capable of, not worrying as whether it's going to be better than these other people.
Yeah.
Because I think doing that, being happy with that is the key to living a happy life, a Christian life.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's one thing that if we can get, actually it's a nice transition into another film series where at least sometimes Catholic or biblical lessons are interspersed with it, is the Rocky series. Before, in the first film in particular, and I love the first film. First Rocky is in my top 10 favorite films of all time. And it's not just there's a scene that he prays before the fight, right? But there's also this, and this I'm connecting it to Amadeus, is that Rocky realizes before his fight with Apollo that it doesn't matter how hard he trains, he can't beat Apollo. The talent gap between the two is just too vast. When he tells that to Adrian, and she doesn't say, and I love this, she doesn't say, you're going to wipe the floor with him, don't worry about it. She just says, well, what will we do? And he says, all I want to do is fight the good fight and go the distance, which he does.
Yeah.
And I love that message in there. And it gets lost, I think, in a lot of the subsequent sequels, where he does beat Apollo, and then he beats Mr. T, and then he beats the superhuman Soviet champion Ivan Drago.
Yeah.
So it got lost in a lot of the subsequent sequels, but it's very much in that first film.
I think people forget how great the first film was because of what you said, what happens in the other ones. Yeah. But that's clearly, when they show him praying before the fight, it's honest prayer. Right, this is not. He's not doing it for other people to see. He's off on his own. Yeah. Right. He's really, really, really praying. right?
And he's not praying for, let me beat Apollo Creed.
Yeah.
He's praying for what he told Adrian.
Yeah.
He wants to go the distance to the best of his abilities.
He wants to show that he's not a bum, right? That there is a humanity there, that he can do this, right? He knows he's not going to be champion, right? He knows he can't beat him. But that doesn't really matter, right? He wants to go the distance, and that's what makes it so fantastic that he goes the distance. And when Apollo Creed is in his ear at the end of the fight, and he tells him there's not going to be a rematch, and he says, "I don't want one." Right?
Yeah.
Right. I think that's one of the. It's both funny and really telling. Right? He did this. He finally was able to do this. Right? He showed he wasn't a bum. He showed he could have a fight for the championship and do his best.
Yeah.
I also think one of the nicest parts of that film, which is also forgotten, I think, is the love story between him and Adrian, which is really wonderful, because she's obviously so unworldly, right, and so shy and so backward, right. So it's hard for her to come to him, and it's hard for him to come to her, right. There's really like a gap between them because they're both socially awkward, and
doesn't help Adrian living with a mean, unpleasant person like Paulie, her brother, and I actually, back in 2006 or 7 when it came out, Rocky Balboa, I guess it was the 6th part of it, Stallone returns to a lot of those themes again. That there's a passage Rocky's reading with Spider Rico, who's the guy he fights in the very first film.
Headbutts him.
Right, he headbutts him, right, and that's what gets Rocky all mad. But where they're talking about passages of the Bible, but another thing, it gets into kind of the Christian healing power of love. I think this is really powerful scene when Adrian's passed away of ovarian cancer, and Rocky and Paulie go to the ice rink, which is gone now. They're what was left of the ice rink, and Paulie says, "I can't do this anymore. You treated her good. You had the good times, and Paulie's not one, you get the idea, for much self-introspection, but he is now. He's like, I treated her bad. I was a bad brother. I had the bad times. And I love how, Rocky could have said, yeah, you were. No, he just turns around and says something that's true. She always loved you, Paulie. And I think it shows that Adrian's such a sweet character, but it goes back to another Catholic theme, is no matter, God always loves us, no matter how badly we screw up. And no matter how much we don't care about him, and how we show we don't love him by not following his teachings, he always still loves us. And one other thing, before we move on to something else, when they did the Creed films, the Creed 2, where they bring back Ivan Drago and his son, it goes into a little bit, can you reconcile with a former bitter enemy? And if you can't become friends, can you at least have a respect for each other? Which is something a lot of people have to live with on a day-to-day basis. Particularly when I go back to European history, given how vicious all the wars were between various different countries, but they still had to share the same continent with each other.
Yeah. I was reading something today that when the American soldiers were first in Britain, they gave them an educational film which starred Burgess Meredith, who was in Rocky, and this little book to read about how you're supposed to behave. And there was a bit in there about, okay, for you Irish guys, right? I know you don't like them. Right? It was basically saying, I know we know you don't like them, and there's this history, but forget about that now, because it was saying something like, this is no time to fight past wars. Forget about that now. We have a much bigger enemy, So treat them with respect and do your best, and don't worry about things that happened in the past. But in European history, as you said, if you just go back far enough, you could always find a case where Group A persecuted Group B, right? I mean, if you allow yourself to just keep going back, you say, well, you did this to us, but then you did this to us before that, and you did this to us before that. At some point, you have to say, well, instead of going back to these points, why don't we look to the future and say, how do we get along, rather than, vengeance again for the last, because it never ends well.
And I kind of think of, also, you bring that up, before we get back to the movies, I mean, my master's thesis at Villanova was about the rearmament of West Germany coming out of the Korean War. And that was in the early 50s. That was so much more recent. And I can't imagine the spiritual struggles of so many people in Western Europe. The French in particular, the Dutch, the Belgians, the British, the Italians a little bit. The Italian-German relationship, World War II, is a complicated one and a disastrous alliance for both countries. But just the idea of accepting the idea of German soldiers in uniform again, and West Germany being a part of NATO, even if it's to contain the Soviet threat, how just on a spiritual level, how extraordinarily difficult that might have been.
I think if it hadn't been for the Soviet threat, Germany still might not be rearmed. Yeah. They may have a role more like Japan does, where the idea of them rearming is so abhorrent to them that they don't want to be part of that. But because of where they were physically, geographically, they had to have a strong army, right? Because this was the first place. This was where West was meeting East, right? And so we desperately needed them.
Yeah. I mean, that's a big dilemma. I mean, the project of the political, economic, and military integration of Western Europe doesn't work without West Germany. But that would mean burying a very recent and very bitter past. And Germany has done a much better job than almost any country of reconciling with its dark past. Certainly better than the Russians have, for example, regarding the Soviet regime. But there wasn't, I mean, most Germans weren't in the early 50s, too contrite or worried about the atrocities committed by the Nazis anywhere in Europe. It was just about surviving on a day-to-day basis. So that's another thing. I mean, do you forgive someone and even if necessary form an alliance with someone who might have done some horrible things and isn't really that sorry about it, or at least is just too busy focusing on their own suffering to focus on anyone else's?
So how about, since you're an expert on Europe and Russia in particular, are there any Russian films that come to mind with a strongly Christian theme? For example, I would think of Andrei Rublev.
Oh, yeah. Andrei Rublev is the great example from the Soviet period. And it's only because Andrei Tarkovsky was such a talented filmmaker and because his works like Detstvo Ivana, Ivan's Childhood, were so respected in the West that film did not get him basically dismissed from making movies, if not in prison somewhere.
Yeah, it's amazing to me that the Soviets let him make that because it's so overtly religious.
Well, they didn't know necessarily what he was making. He said he was making a historical epic about medieval Russia. And when the Politburo saw it, well, when the heads of the Soviet film industry saw it, and they told Brezhnev and the other leaders of the Soviet Politburo, particularly Mikhail Suslov, who was the ideology boss, they were furious that he wasted Soviet resources on a religious film. And so Andrei Rublev wasn't shown for almost 20 years. It wasn't fully released until the Gorbachev period, until the late 80s under Glasnost and Perestroika.
What a powerful movie. And there you're really he's showing the themes of suffering. And I think this is the most common Russian theological thing. How do you use suffering to grow spiritually, right? Which Andrei certainly does. And just at the end of the film, when they're just showing all of the icons that he had made, it's really extraordinarily moving, right? And you see him; he has a terrible life, right? I mean, they're being attacked and all this kind of stuff. He's living in a terrible time, but he uses all of this to grow spiritually. And I think given that the time in the Soviet Union when they were making this, the message is pretty clear. So I can imagine why they were so ticked off at him.
Yeah, right. And the other problem was during the famous scene of the Tatars. When the Russian murder for the Mongols, when they raid that village, the other controversial thing was Rublev showed Muscovite soldiers and cavalrymen fighting with the Tatars, raiding the villages too, engaging in atrocities too, which did historically happen, but that wasn't something that was widely acknowledged by Russian historians, because eventually it's Moscow, that unites Russia after 1480. But there were also, the reason why that was kind of forbidden was that was another thing you didn't talk about in the Soviet Union, was the collaboration between sometimes local populations and the Germans during the Second World War.
Yeah.
Because some of them had hated the Soviet regime so much they would have supported anyone who was fighting them.
Yeah.
That's a fascinating case. I mean, it's difficult, of course, in the USSR because it was very difficult to put religious themes in anything that wasn't heavily censored. But actually, Ivan's Childhood has some religious imagery in it as well that I'm sometimes a little surprised got past some of the Soviet censors. But Tarkovsky keeps it kind of subtle. I mean, that was the dilemma for artists who live under totalitarian systems. Is Tarkovsky wanted to tell stories, and for artists, the regime expects you to make propaganda, or you don't work.
Unbearable Blood was definitely not propaganda,
No,
right?
Not at all.
But it does have some, when they were building the balloon in the beginning, the idea is that, look, we had this technology and nobody else did this. I think there was a little bit of Russian nationalism there, right?
Oh, yeah.
But, even I think the symbolism of building the bell in the end, where it was just like, okay, right, all of these people, the kid who's in charge of the bell, he doesn't know what he's doing.
Right.
Right? He's clearly has no idea what he's doing. But he has to act like he knows what he's doing. So when they're about to ring the bell, and it finally does ring, right, it's a giant success. It's almost like you're building yourself spiritually through this struggle, right? So it's really a wonderful thing. But it's also the kind of film that maybe you have to watch 3 or 4 times before you really grasp all the things, right? Because there's really a lot of things going on in there.
Oh, yeah, and I love the scene with the pagans, too, at one point, because in Russia, pagan beliefs kind of either exist, and people who believed in pre-Christian religions existed side by side of Orthodox Christians, and in many cases, certain of their ideas kind of get merged into Orthodox Christianity. And in fairness, that's a phenomenon in a number of Catholic countries as well, right? I mean, if you look at a difference between, say, Italian Catholicism and Irish Catholicism, some pre-Christian ideas from the Roman times still made their way into the Catholic Church.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and practices and rituals. And speaking of that, by the way, kind of the Christian mysticism, I mean, another thing where you see a lot of Catholic imagery, sometimes it gets a little exploitative, but of course is in horror films. And the most famous example of that, of course, and it's a very Catholic film, is The Exorcist from 1973. And it's
also with a local tie. The person who played the priest is a graduate of our university.
Jason Miller, exactly. And the fascinating thing about The Exorcist, okay, he's not. Father Merrin, played by Max von Sydow, is the title character. But you go back and look at that film. I mean, a lot of people, obviously Linda Blair and the depictions of her demonic possession gets a lot of the attention. But I watch that film every October. I spend most of October watching horror movies. Father Karras, Jason Miller's character, is the main character of that film. And he, which is not to say that Linda Blair and Ellen Burstyn's character aren't important. They are. But he is the lead character.
His is the spiritual struggle.
His is the great spiritual struggle. He thinks he's losing his faith. He could have been a famous, wealthy psychiatrist if he hadn't entered the priesthood. And that's something that contributes to his mother's confinement in that state hospital in hellish conditions, and then her death afterwards. And I love how Father Merrin, a legendary performance by Max von Sydow, tells Father Karras, and it's a great spiritual lesson, the devil will mix lies with truth to tempt you and weaken you. That's one of his great abilities. Right, and that line always comes to me when during the exorcism, when I think it might be the most powerful scene in the movie, when, if not the devil, Pazuzu, that demon, yells at Karras, "You killed your mother. You left her alone to die." Right, and he just yells at her to shut up. Right,
yeah.
And ultimately, both priests have to give their lives to rid.
Well, he speaks to in his mother's language, in Greek, and so that he really feels that it's his mother talking to him, right? As if he were a little boy, and there's his mother talking to him, right? And it is a devastating scene.
It is, and again, it shows that good can triumph over evil, but not, and it does in the end. Even that eerie final shot of the steps, but it often can come with tremendous cost. I love also that for Max von Sydow, who grew up in Sweden in a Lutheran environment, he said he had to do a lot of research on Catholic understandings of the devil, because he said in the Lutheran Church, Satan's not as centralized of a figure, and sometimes in our traditions he's even portrayed as kind of a mischievous figure rather than an evil one. So he had to kind of refamiliarize himself with Catholic understandings of it in order to effectively play a Jesuit exorcist. But a number of the Jesuit priests in that movie are played by Jesuits. Like Karras' friend, for example. he's who offers him the final contrition at the end when he's dying. He was a Jesuit priest.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And actually, he looks devastated when he's grasping Karras's hand after he goes down the steps, that's because William Friedkin, who was kind of the stereotypical tyrannical director, he wasn't getting the reaction he wanted from that priest. He's like, "You're not sad enough." He said, "Come here. All right, I know what to do. I know how to get the reaction out of you." And he slapped him hard across the face, and then said, "Go do the scene." So if he looks shaken, and not just a little tap on the cheek, he slapped him hard across the face. So if that priest looks really shaken, just think about what the director just did.
Yeah.
One other thing, in order to get the right reaction out of Ellen Burstyn when she's thrown backwards in that scene, they had put this rope around her back that would yank her backwards, but she wanted to brace herself for it, right?
Yeah.
So Friedkin explicitly said, yank her when she's not ready. That'll get the reaction we want. So when you see Ellen Burstyn fall to the ground, she's screaming in pain. That isn't acting. Yeah. She had a back injury that took years to heal from that.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So,
so let's talk some other films. How about The Robe you mentioned as a film?
Yeah, I mean, that's I think that's from the Sword and Sandal biblical epics of the 50s. I think that one, along with Ben-Hur, is the one that stands the test of time the best. Yeah. Again, a lot of what we know of the after the crucifixion of Christ involving the Romans who did it, I mean, it's all conjecture. But it's a fairly solid film for that era. You get the idea, though. It almost feels like a little bit. That film feels like a little bit like a Sunday school lecture come to life a little bit. And ironically, I think the most interesting character of that film is Caligula, right? I mean, that actor gives such a memorable performance as him. But it was certainly an important film for the time because if you look at it, it was almost a trope for sword and sandal films in the 50s in particular, was they all centered around somehow the birth or the crucifixion or both of Jesus. It was just considered an essential part of the film because you had to get Christian audiences in there.
Again, they were also wonderful to look at. They were incredibly cinematic, right? Something that demands to be seen on a big screen.
Absolutely.
Not on your phone, right? So, I mean, you really got it. So they were remarkably artistically well done, beautiful, right? To watch.
And even if I'm like, okay, the Ten Commandments doesn't involve Jesus, but that's because it was centuries before. Yeah. Well, that's still very much a religious film.
Yeah.
Right? Even a film like Ben-Hur, for example, I mean, Jesus kind of comes and goes in the film, but he's still in there. You know, and also that film's a conversion story about how a Jewish prince becomes a Christian. Following his mother and his sister being healed of leprosy. Right?
Yeah,
that's what makes Spartacus in 1960 kind of the turning point because that was the first. It was one of the first big sword and sandal films that did not focus really in any way on Christianity. There's one line in the narration at the beginning of Spartacus that said, before the emergence of Christianity, that would bring about a new civilization after the fall of Rome. But that's it. And of course, it makes sense. It's set during the slave rebellion of 65 BC, or gladiator rebellion, as some ancient historians say. That's obviously well before the birth and life of Christ. But that's kind of the turning point that you started to have films after then set in the ancient world that didn't explicitly focus on Christianity.
But it's interesting you mentioned the Ten Commandments because I think the power of film is so much that when people think about, say, the Exodus, they think of Charlton Heston, not Moses, right? More people have seen that film than have read Exodus or the first 5 books in general, right? That their image of what went on is Charlton Heston standing there with the rod over his head, right? That's a very powerful image, or coming down with the stone tablets, right? I think films, in that sense, are so powerful that in most people's imagination, they see the film rather than what they've learned their whole life, right? That's the image of the Ten Commandments. I think more recently, Mel Gibson's movie on the Passion of the Christ, which was highly controversial, and nobody wanted to do it, right? Nobody wanted to put up the money because they thought it was going to be a disaster. And then Mel Gibson ended up making just gobs and gobs of money because he put his own money up. But I think those images are what people now think of when they think of the crucifixion.
Oh, I think so, and particularly the scourging as well.
Oh, it was brutal.
Yeah. The Roman, given the time period, the Romans weren't necessarily more brutal than most other ancient civilizations, but they were certainly no less. And as I always tell my students, just from the historical perspective, crucifixion was a horrible way to go. And I do like how the film emphasizes that aspect of the physical suffering.
Yeah.
Ironically, one thing that I always think is kind of hilarious is that very different depiction of Jesus, right? In both on Broadway and the movie Jesus Christ Superstar. But I like how both that play and movie and Passion of the Christ portray Herod very similarly. I always thought, it's kind of this, not Herod the Great, but his son, Herod Antipas, is this kind of foppish, fey, clownish king with all these weirdos hanging around his court. Yeah. And I've always thought that was an interesting parallel. Actually, I will say, and I'm certainly never a person who thinks, well, it's more recent, it's better. But a film that dealt with some of the same themes of the road, but I thought did a little bit better, was a film that came out about 7 years ago. I think it came out in 2015, called Risen. And it's got Joseph Fiennes as a Roman centurion who is investigating why Christ was crucified and does he have any of his disciples still around, and how do we deal with them? And so it's kind of portrayed a little bit as an investigative movie, but it leads him to eventually become a Christian at the end of the film. And I thought it was really effectively done, and it was kind of fascinating. He shows up shortly after Christ has expired, right? Just coming in, and he sees them in the distance, right? And it was fascinating to have that kind of perspective. Probably the central event in Western civilization, right? I've always argued Christ is at the very center of Western history. But he doesn't realize the profound importance of what just happened the way you or I would. But that's another example, I think, of a recent film with clear religious themes that had good production values and, if not A-list, at least B-plus list actors in it, giving their all in these performances. So
I was just reading about that in the early Christian literature when they were talking about martyrs. The Romans, of course, were not reading Christian literature, but the Romans looked at this as, we're humiliating these people. We're throwing them to the lions. Like, they thought a sense that they were winning. But in the Christian literature of the time, they were, like in the story of Perpetua and Felicity and all of this, they were seeing this as a great victory for them. And that martyrdom, first of all, was bringing them right to God. And also that by showing that they were unafraid and that they were gaining strength in this, not the Roman persecutors, right? So like you're saying, the Roman coming down, not understanding the centrality of Christ, right? That not understanding what was really going on. They almost viewed it as just a minor inconvenience,
And obviously, our colleague Bob, much more of an expert than me on this, but that was the one thing that struck to the Romans about Palestine, about the Jews, was this wasn't our wealthiest province or our most important one. But man, these people do not want to assimilate. Yeah. They won't adopt any of our ideas or any of our customs. They have this one God who they believe they're this chosen people. And that's why they don't feel like they need to adopt any of our ways, because their one God has shown them the right way. I mean, a lot of the Romans would reflect on that the Greeks and the Gauls and many others, or eventually they'll adopt our religion, our names. Some of them want to become Roman citizens. Yeah. Jews do not. Yeah. They will not. Yeah. They're stubborn people.
They were just so problematic, right?
Yeah.
And they didn't even view in the first century the difference between Jews and Christians. It meant nothing to them. They were just all troublemakers,
right?
Who wouldn't sacrifice to their gods and wouldn't play by their rules.
And wouldn't see Caesar as divine.
Yeah. Not that they even really saw Caesar as divine. They just wanted you to come to their way of thinking.
Right.
They wanted you to say, yeah, you're right. And because the Romans weren't really involved in the day-to-day running of their provinces, they let you run your own world.
Yeah.
As long as you agreed that Rome was on top of you and you paid tribute.
Yeah, you pay tribute to Caesar what he needs, right? And you don't ally with our enemies. And yeah, they granted their provinces a great deal of self-rule. I mean, how could they not?
Yeah.
Given the limits of technology and transportation at the time.
But you could keep your own culture and do all this as long as you say ours is better. Whatever we say is better, and you just admit that. And like you said, a lot of the people wanted to be Roman citizens, right? They wanted that that benefit, right? Because it was a great thing to be Roman citizens. Even if you were a Roman citizen being killed, you got to be beheaded instead of crucified. Right? So you had 10 seconds of pain rather than just hours and hours and hours of excruciating pain.
Yeah. But no, I agree with you. I mean, again, Bob certainly knows more than me, but yeah, I think it's pretty clear that at least within the capital of Rome, there wasn't too much of a belief that most Roman emperors were actually divine, given how many of them get assassinated. Yeah. I mean, if you were a Roman emperor who died in his bed and weren't murdered by your praetorians or something like that, you were a rare exception, right?
Yeah.
But one other thing, I don't know how much time we have left, but one other thing I think that I really admired was the Netflix series from a few years ago, which was the adaptation of the comic book character Daredevil, the Marvel Comics character. And Daredevil has always been one of my favorite superheroes growing up. Marvel character, so he's in the world with Spider-Man and Captain America and Iron Man. He's a lawyer named Matt Murdock. He operates in Hell's Kitchen. He's blind. An accident as a child blinded him, but gave him extraordinary powers. This extraordinary perception and balance he has. And Daredevil was kind of a mid-level Marvel character, and then the brilliant comic writer Frank Miller took over the character in the early 80s, and he did an incredible few years writing comic books with the character Daredevil. And one thing that he really played up for the character of Matt Murdock, Daredevil, was his Roman Catholic faith, which had always been in the background, but Miller makes it central to the character. And Miller himself, again, kind of like Robert Bolt, not a terribly religious person, but they asked him, why did he make Murdoch's Catholic faith so essential to him? And Miller said, anyone who's a lawyer by day and then dresses up as a costume and is a vigilante beating up criminals at night has got to be a Roman Catholic. I love that line. But they could have easily discarded it when they adopted the character for the Netflix series. But they actually, throughout all of the 3 seasons of the show, and then one team-up series where he's with these other characters, they really made that an important part of the character. And they hired a Catholic actor from England, Charlie Cox, to play him. And they interwove that as part of his character throughout the series. He regularly goes to confession. He has a priest who knows he's a vigilante and counsels him on it. He really struggles with whether we can take a life, even a really horrible person like his archenemy, this character called Wilson Fisk, the Kingpin, and whether if he doesn't take a life but this guy keeps killing and hurting others, does that make him liable for it? It really deals with these weighty religious issues in a complex way and doesn't offer a lot of easy answers. And I just, on a personal level, was so glad to see that, because they could have discarded that, that they stuck with it. And now that the character is being integrated into the MCU movies, he showed up in Spider-Man No Way Home, and Disney Plus has said the series was canceled by Netflix, but they're saying they want to revive it. You know, I hope that will still be a part of the character. But that's, I thought, another great recent example of a form of very popular entertainment dealing with issues of faith, particularly Catholic faith, in a serious way.
So how do you view, say, the Marvel universe or the Star Wars universe? It seems to me that the fundamental underlying idea of these is good versus evil, if I'm not wrong. How do you see that playing out in terms of Catholicism, Christianity?
Well, I mean, I think one day, thousands of years from now, that the Marvel and DC and Star Wars heroes will be seen by representing our culture the way we see the Greek and Roman mythology. Right? And I think that good versus evil stories have always had a broad appeal throughout cultures for thousands of years. I think because Disney owns the MCU and they want to make their films as broadly based as possible for as broad of an audience. Oh, and Star Wars too. They
pretty much own everything.
Right. They just don't own the DC characters.
Give them time.
Well, Warner Brothers got a tight grip on them. Warner Brothers would only sell them if they went bankrupt. But they'll try and keep a lot of explicit religious messages to a minimum because of that. So I don't think you'll see too much. As entertaining as I find a lot of those films, you're not going to find too many spiritual messages within them. I mean, that's why, again, even though he was a Marvel character too, they were able to get away with it for Daredevil was because, again, his Catholic faith is so important to the character, and it was on Netflix, and Disney didn't have the rights to the character yet. One thing I do think is very popular films, which came out, God, almost 20 years ago, was Lord of the Rings. And I do like that. Peter Jackson, not a religious deep thinker like J.R.R. Tolkien, but then who are compared to Tolkien. But I do like how Tolkien's Catholic humanism is present in the films. And Jackson said, and Philippa Boyens, his wife and writing partner, said, we have to keep that in the films because it's so central to Tolkien's conception of Middle Earth and the world he created. And I think there's a pivotal scene in Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, and Return of the King where you see that comes through very strongly. And so in Fellowship of the Ring, it's when Frodo says, I wish the ring had never come to me, and Gandalf says, all people who live through dark times wish they weren't, but it's not for them to decide. All you can do is make the best use of the time given to you. And then Sam's famous speech in The Two Towers that at the end that there's good in the world, Mr. Frodo, and it's worth fighting for. And then, of course, the scene, I would say, in Return of the King when Gandalf is talking to Merry, and they think they might be about to die, and then Gandalf says, no, this isn't the end. Death is just a path we all must take, right? And once you've passed it, you see it, the bright shores and the green distant fields. So I like how there was a little bit of that in all the films. And there's a little bit of that in the Hobbit trilogy too, although not as much.
I think for Tolkien and, say, C.S. Lewis, they really had the idea that story was the way to convince people of things. Not convince people of things, to put forth really important ideas, right? So it's in all of their work, you had these phenomenal stories that people wanted to read, and they were getting the philosophical, theological points they wanted almost by accident, right? In other words, instead of saying, here's this, I'm going to make you read Aquinas, and that's going to make you think about these things, they give it to you with a story, right? And when you read it in the story, I think it affects more people that way. So see, even in series like Star Wars, I think Star Wars hides the spirituality just by calling it the Force or something, right? So, I mean, that's a pseudo kind of religion going on. And I think Star Wars is all about whether you embrace the bad side or the good side of these things, right? It's all about the temptation, right? The temptation is to follow the dark side because it makes you powerful, right? And I think there's overtly sort of religious themes in there that are sort of, without ever saying this is a religion or this is a religious theme, right? But I think in modern filmmaking, they try to, many times, try to hide anything that's like good versus evil. But the films that make a big impact, like Star Wars or the Marvel Universe, they're talking about good versus evil, because I think that's what people want to see.
And there are, like in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, they are very careful not to do anything that makes it sound like they're, oh, well, in this world, that there's no way God can exist. Like, for example, in the Thor films, we have the Norse gods, and now in the new Thor film coming out, Zeus, played by Russell Crowe, is in it. So the Greek gods are starting to show up too. But they're saying, well, they're all extraterrestrial beings. They live on another planet or something like that, or another dimension.
They're not really gods. Yeah.
They're not really gods. And there are a few characters who are shown to be religious, like Captain America, Steve Rogers. There's like a scene in the first Avengers film where Black Widow, played by Scarlett Johansson, says about Thor and Loki, hey, you got to be careful around these two. They're basically gods. And Steve Rogers said, there's only one God, ma'am, and he doesn't dress like that. So you get a little bit of it in there. Because, again, Disney also doesn't want to... They're not going to do something like His Dark Materials, for example, by saying that, oh, here's a fictional universe that proves that the biblical God or the Christian, Jewish, Islamic God doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Right. They're not going to go in that direction.
No.
Ironically, Zack Snyder, in some of his films, like Man of Steel, for example, and Justice League did some more explicit Christian imagery. I mean, that's another cinematic character. They make Christ allegories all the time, is of course Superman, for somewhat obvious reasons. But Man of Steel, the 2013 film Man of Steel has a lot of Christian imagery in it as well. I mean, there's when Superman's trying to decide whether he should reveal who he is and turn himself over to General Zod, who does he actually go to talk to about it? A priest, right? Who's portrayed fairly respectfully, right, in it. So there's a little bit of that there. This could be a whole other podcast. I kind of wish if Warner Brothers had just let Zack Snyder finish his vision of DC. They kind of got nervous and forced him to change directions, and then fired him, and they've been kind of spiraling all over the place ever since. So.
Well, what do you think? I think in the Hollywood hierarchs, let's say, for the past 70 years, they've always been afraid of religion. For example, like in even in a small thing, in the Charlie Brown Christmas special, they did not want an explicit mention of what Christmas actually was. And Charles Schultz demanded it, and he said, "No, this is what we're doing. We're actually going to tell. Linus is going to come out and tell us." And it really scared the Hollywood producers tremendously. They didn't want an explicit thing like that. They wanted something saccharine and sweet that they didn't have to worry about.
Yeah, as broad, to appeal to as broad of a common denominator as possible. And Charles Schultz really fought for that. And I think that scene with Linus is one of the things that has made it stand the test of time. I mean, pretty much every comic strip character or animated character has had a Christmas special about them, but none are as beloved. Some are still very popular, but none are as beloved as a Charlie Brown Christmas. And I think it's because of the centrality of the Christian message is one of the parts of it. That's also an incredibly groundbreaking work. It was the first animated film to use children to voice child characters. Before that, it was always adults pretending to be children. And also, I mean, Vincent Guaraldi's legendary jazz score, that was revolutionary. They wanted to move away from kind of the generic cartoon music. And that's part of the appeal, too. And because there was a very limited budget, that's why the animation is somewhat limited. But again, that's kind of part of its appeal.
So you could play any one of those tunes, just 5 notes from it, everybody knows what you're talking about.
Exactly.
Right? So many times in other shows and films where they just play the sad music, and someone walks away, you know exactly what's going on, right? They're playing into this notion. Okay, now I'm really sad, like Charlie Brown is sad. Charles Schultz also did. He was one of the first to have an African American kid in the Franklin. And a lot of the people the people who were publishing the script said, "No, you can't do that," and he said, "Well, I'm going to do it. You could stop publishing my comic strip, but I'm going to do this." And they didn't want him in the Thanksgiving special to be sitting on the same table as the white kids and all these kind of things. And he said, "No, we're just going to do this. You don't like it, don't play it." So I mean, you have to give him a lot of credit for being willing to stand up for what was right.
And actually, I'm a huge fan of the Peanuts comic strip. I have the entire run, that was republished, and there's a lot of Christian themes, especially in the 50s and 60s comic strips. And then Schultz moved away from that a little bit in the 70s and 80s, and then kind of came back to it a little bit in the 90s. It's fascinating watching the evolution of the strip. Snoopy starts acting more like a dog towards the end of this strip. And you could also tell that Charlie Brown finally hits a home run in the late 90s and wins the game. You could tell Schultz knew it was coming to an end. But I mean, again, that could be a separate podcast. There's a great book written in the 60s called The Gospel According to Peanuts by this Calvinist minister named Robert Short, which is still a great examination of the religious themes within the strip. And so it's certainly out there. I mean, Schultz did a pretty good job of subtly addressing the issues of the day, like introducing Franklin, or the fact that Franklin's father was serving in the Vietnam War.
And he wasn't hitting you over the head with it. He wasn't like making a political point. Franklin was there, right? He was just he was just there. And he thought long and hard because a woman had written to him and asked him for a black character, and he didn't want to just throw it in to throw it in. He really wanted to think about it. Does this make sense? Is it right even for him to put this kind of character in? Should he be writing about something maybe he knows nothing about, right? He thought about it. He was a deep thinker and didn't want to act just rashly or politically. He wanted to understand this. But as you know, my Facebook profile is Linus giving a...
That's right.
Right, so I really do appreciate this.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for your time here today. It's been very enlightening. Thank you very much for all the information you gave us.
Thank you for having me. It was a real pleasure.